There is a coin. It is small, barely larger than a man's thumbnail. It weighs less than 2 grams. It is made of gold, and the gold is very pure, purer than most Roman aurei of the same period, which tells you something about the people who made it. On one side, a face, a king's face, round, stylized, staring forward with the fixed authority that all ancient monarchs share on their currency. Around the face, letters, not Latin, not Greek, though the Aksumites knew both, but Ge'ez, a Semitic script that flows in rows like soldiers marching, one of the oldest alphabets in continuous use on Earth. On the other side, and this is where it gets interesting, a cross. Not a Roman cross, not a Byzantine cross, an Aksumite cross, with its distinctive flared arms and its quiet, confident geometry stamped into gold 3 centuries before most of Europe had heard the gospel preached in any language they understood. This coin was minted in the early 4th century of the Common Era, in a city most modern people cannot place on a map, by a civilization most modern people have never heard of, in a kingdom that at its height controlled both sides of the Red Sea, traded directly with the Roman Empire, with Sassanid Persia, with the subcontinent of India, with the island of Sri Lanka, and with kingdoms deep in the African interior whose names even the Aksumites may not have recorded. The coin is real. You can see it in museums. You can hold its weight in your imagination. And the man who made it, the man who carved the die, heated the crucible, poured the molten gold, positioned the blank, and struck it with a hammer until the king's face appeared. That man is the thread we will follow. His name is lost, so we will call him what he was, the minter. And his story is the story of Aksum. Part 1. The Plateau. Begin with the land. You must always begin with the land, because civilizations are not ideas, they are responses. Responses to soil and rain and altitude and the angle of trade winds and the location of mountain passes and the quality of stone that happens to lie beneath your feet. The Ethiopian Highlands are one of the most dramatic landscapes on the African continent. Imagine a vast plateau lifted 2,000 meters above sea level, riven with gorges so deep they take a full day to descend. Flat-topped mountains called ambas rise like natural fortresses, their cliff faces sheer and red in the morning light. Rivers cut through basalt canyons. The soil, where it gathers in the valleys, is deep and volcanic and extraordinarily fertile. The rains come in 2 seasons.
The Belg, the small rains, arrive in spring. The Krempt, the great rains, hammer down from June through September, turning rivers into torrents and painting the highlands green in a way that shocks travelers who expected Africa to be uniformly dry. This is not the Sahara. Indigenous juniper and olive trees that grew here long before eucalyptus was imported, of terraced fields where teff and barley and emmer wheat have been cultivated for millennia. And here, on this high plateau, in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, a city grew. Its name was Aksum, or Aksum, depending on your transliteration. But the people who built it would have pronounced it with a guttural precision that neither spelling quite captures, a word spoken in Ge'ez, the language of inscriptions and liturgy and royal decrees, the language that would eventually become the sacred tongue of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and remain so for 17 centuries and counting. Aksum. Say it aloud. Feel how the word sits in the mouth, heavy at the front, a percussive stop at the end, like a hammer falling on a die, like a coin being struck. The city did not appear suddenly. Nothing in history appears suddenly, no matter how much we want origin stories to be clean. Before Aksum, there was a long, slow accumulation. The Ethiopian Highlands had been inhabited for tens of thousands of years. The earliest farming communities in the Horn of Africa are among the oldest on the continent, but the specific cultural tradition that would become Aksumite civilization seems to have crystallized sometime around the first millennium BCE, in the region where the highlands slope down toward the Red Sea coast. There are tantalizing connections to South Arabia, to the Sabian kingdoms across the narrow strait of Bab el-Mandeb. Inscriptions in a South Arabian script appear at sites like Yeha, a pre-Aksumite settlement with a magnificent stone temple that still stands, its dressed masonry so precise that early European visitors refused to believe Africans could have built it. They were wrong, of course, but the South Arabian influence was real, at least in the early period. Trade flowed across the Red Sea, ideas crossed with the goods, writing systems were adapted, architectural techniques were shared. And then, gradually, something distinctly local emerged. The South Arabian elements were absorbed, transformed, made Ethiopian. The script evolved from borrowed Sabian characters into Ge'ez, a writing system that uniquely among Semitic scripts writes vowels as modifications of consonant signs, creating an alpha-syllabary of extraordinary elegance. The architecture shifted from South Arabian temple forms to something new, tall, stepped structures built of precisely fitted stone, rising in tiers like geometric mountains.
By the 1st century of the Common Era, Aksum was a city, and not just any city. A Greek-speaking merchant sailor, anonymous, pragmatic, writing sometime around 40 to 70 CE, composed a document that historians call the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. It is essentially a trade manual, a guide to the ports and peoples of the Red Sea, the East African coast, the Arabian Peninsula, and the western coast of India. The Periplus mentions Aksum. It describes the kingdom's main port, a Julis on the Eritrean coast, as a thriving hub where ivory, rhinoceros horn, hippopotamus hide, tortoise shell, and obsidian were traded for cloth, glassware, brass, copper, iron, wine, olive oil, and, notably, gold and silver coins from the Roman Empire. The author identifies the ruler of Aksum as Zoskalis, a name that sounds Greek but was probably an approximation of a Gez name that the sailor's tongue couldn't quite wrap around. Zoskalis, the Periplus says, was miserly in his ways and always striving for more, but otherwise upright. It is the kind of review a merchant gives another merchant, grudging respect. He drives a hard bargain, but he keeps his word. And the fact that a Roman-era trade manual mentions an Ethiopian king by name, praises his commercial acumen, describes his capital as the destination point for goods flowing from across the known world, tells you everything you need to know about Aksum's position in the ancient economy. This was not a marginal place. This was a node, a critical, irreplaceable node in the network that connected Rome to India, the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, the wheat and wine of the West to the spices and silk of the East. And whoever controlled a Julis, whoever taxed the goods that passed through that harbor, held one of the most valuable commercial positions in the ancient world. The Aksumites held it for centuries.
The gold came from the interior, from the regions the Aksumites called Sasu, probably somewhere in what is now western Ethiopia or Sudan, where it was extracted from alluvial deposits by peoples who traded it northward through a chain of intermediaries that the Aksumite merchants had cultivated over generations. The gold arrived in Aksum as dust, as nuggets, as crude ingots, and in the royal workshops that answered directly to the Nagusa Nagast, the king of kings, the gold was refined, alloyed to precise specifications, and transformed into two things: jewelry for the court and coins for the world. The boy watched. He watched his uncle heat the crucible, a small clay vessel, barely larger than a fist, capable of withstanding temperatures that would crack ordinary pottery. He watched the gold melt, shifting from solid to liquid with that peculiar reluctance that gold has, as if it knows its own value and resists transformation. He watched the pouring, the thin stream of molten metal filling a stone mold, cooling into flat blanks, flan, the numismatists call them, each one a small disk of potential. And then the striking. The die, a cylinder of hardened bronze with the king's image carved in reverse, in negative, so that when it was pressed into the gold, the image would emerge in positive, raised and legible. One die for the obverse, the king's face, one die for the reverse, whatever symbol the king had chosen for the back. The blank placed between the dies, the hammer raised, the single, precise blow, and there, in the space of a heartbeat, a piece of metal became a statement, a declaration, a portable, indestructible, universally legible announcement that said, "Here is a king, here is a kingdom, here is power that can afford to stamp its face on gold and send it into the world." The boy was mesmerized, not by the gold itself, though gold is always mesmerizing, but by the transformation, by the idea that a skilled hand and a carved die could turn raw material into sovereignty. He apprenticed to his uncle. He learned to carve dies. He learned the alloy ratios, how much copper to add for durability, how to keep the gold content high enough that foreign merchants would accept the coins at face value. He learned the royal protocols, which symbols were permitted, which inscriptions were required, how the king's face must be rendered so that it conveyed authority without crossing into the sacrilege of too literal representation. He burned his hands many times. The scars accumulated like a second language written on his skin, a language that said, "I have paid for this knowledge in pain." By the time he was 30, he was the master minter.
By the time he was 40, he would be asked to do something no Aksumite mentor had ever done before. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Part 3. The Economy of Distance. To understand why Aksum minted coins at all, and this is a question worth pausing over because most African kingdoms did not, you have to understand Aksum's unique position in the ancient world's trade networks. Look at a map. The Red Sea is a long, narrow body of water running roughly northwest to southeast, separating Africa from Arabia. At its northern end, it nearly touches the Mediterranean, the Suez Isthmus, which the ancients bridged with canals and overland portage routes. At its southern end, it opens through the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, named for the treacherous currents, into the Gulf of Aden and then the vast Indian Ocean. Anyone who controlled the southern Red Sea controlled the bottleneck, and Aksum controlled the southern Red Sea. Adulis, its port, sat on the Eritrean coast, perfectly positioned to intercept and tax the monsoon trade, the seasonal rhythm of winds that allowed ships to sail from Arabia and India to East Africa and back, a rhythm that ancient navigators had exploited for millennia. From the African interior, Aksum exported ivory, enormous quantities of ivory. The elephants of the Ethiopian Highlands and the Sudanese lowlands provided tusks that were prized across the Roman world for furniture, decorative panels, religious statuary, and the diptych tablets that Roman consuls distributed as gifts. Also, gold, emeralds, obsidian, frankincense, myrrh, civet musk, living animals for the arena. The Romans had an insatiable appetite for exotic beasts, enslaved people, rhinoceros horn, tortoise shell, and a mysterious aromatic resin called ladin that appears in the sources without clear modern identification. In return, Aksum imported Roman manufactures, glass, metalwork, textiles, wine, olive oil, and crucially, Roman coins. Gold aurei and silver denarii flowed into Adulis in massive quantities, and they circulated alongside Aksumite coinage in a dual monetary system that tells us something remarkable about the kingdom's economic sophistication. Because minting your own coins in the ancient world was not just an economic act, it was a political act. It was a declaration of sovereignty. Only a handful of states outside the Greco-Roman world minted their own gold coinage in this period: Persia, the Kushan Empire, and Aksum. That's it, 3. And of these, only Aksum can the Kushans bothered to maintain the kind of strict weight standards and purity controls that would make their coins acceptable in international trade. The minter knew this. Every time he struck a coin, he was not just producing currency, he was producing a message. A message that traveled in the purse of a merchant from Adulis to the ports of Gujarat, from the Red Sea to the Nile, from the incense markets of Hadramaut to the warehouses of Alexandria. The message said, "We are here. We are real. We are as powerful as Rome." And for 3 centuries, it was the truth. But coins were small. The Aksumites also built large, very large. In the center of their capital, they erected stelae, monolithic obelisks carved from single blocks of nepheline syenite, a hard, fine-grained stone quarried from hills several kilometers west of the city. The largest of these stelae, the Great Stelae, now fallen and shattered, stood over 33 meters tall and weighed approximately 520 tons. 520 tons, carved from a single block of stone, transported several kilometers, raised upright. To put this in perspective, the largest obelisk the Romans ever erected, the Vatican obelisk, originally brought from Egypt by Caligula, weighs approximately 330 tons. The Aksumites exceeded this by nearly 200 tons, and they did it in a place that most Romans would have considered the edge of the known world. The stelae were not plain columns. They were carved to resemble multi-story buildings, tower houses with false doors and windows etched into the stone in meticulous relief, each story slightly smaller than the one below, creating a tapering effect that gave the monuments an almost modern architectural elegance. They marked the graves of kings. Beneath each stelae lay an elaborate underground tomb, a complex of chambers cut into bedrock, sealed with massive stone slabs, containing the remains of Aksumite royalty and the goods they were expected to need in whatever came next. The minter saw them being raised. Imagine what it must have been like. The engineering alone staggers comprehension. Without cranes, without iron tools, the Aksumites worked primarily in bronze and stone. They quarried, shaped, transported, and erected stone monuments of a scale that would challenge modern equipment. The workforce, hundreds of men, possibly thousands, hauling the stone on wooden sledges over prepared roads, using ramps and counterweights and techniques we can only partially reconstruct because the Aksumites, like so many ancient engineers, left no operating manuals. The sound, stone grinding on stone, the chanting of work gangs coordinating their pulls, the deep percussive thud as the base of the stelae settled into its prepared socket, a massive stone platform with a recess carved to receive the obelisk's base like a key fitting a lock. And then, if you were standing in the right place at the right moment, the stelae rising, slowly, inch by terrible inch, the ropes straining, the counterweight platforms descending, the angle changing from 45 degrees to 60 to 75, until, with a final shuddering adjustment, it stood vertical. 30 meters of carved stone pointing at the Ethiopian sky.
a finger raised to heaven, a statement of power so absolute it needed no words. The minter would have understood. He trafficked in symbols, after all. He knew that power must be made visible to be real. A coin in the hand, an obelisk against the sky, different scales, same principle. Look at me. Look at what I can do. Look at what my kingdom can afford. Remember. Part 5. The Conversion. And then, sometime around 330 CE, give or take a decade, in the midst of Aksum's greatest power, everything changed. Not through conquest, not through collapse, through a choice. The king, Ezana, whose name appears on the coins the minter was already producing, converted to Christianity. The story, as it comes down to us, through Rufinus of Aquileia, a Roman church historian writing in the early 5th century, goes like this. 2 young Christian men from Tyre, Frumentius and Edesius, were traveling with their uncle on a merchant vessel in the Red Sea. The ship was attacked, the crew was killed. The boys survived and were brought to the Aksumite court, where they were educated and eventually rose to positions of influence. Frumentius, in particular, became close to the royal family. He tutored the young prince Ezana. He organized the small community of Christian merchants in Adulis. And when Ezana came of age and assumed the throne, Frumentius was instrumental in the king's decision to embrace the new faith. Frumentius traveled to Alexandria, where the patriarch Athanasius, yes, the Athanasius, the hammer of the Arians, one of the most consequential theologians in Christian history, consecrated him as the first bishop of Aksum. He returned to Ethiopia as Abba Salama, Father of Peace, and the Aksumite Church was born. Now, how much of this is historical and how much is hagiography is a question scholars debate endlessly. The broad outlines are probably accurate. Ezana's conversion is confirmed by his own inscriptions, which shift mid-reign from invoking the old gods to invoking the Lord of Heaven, and eventually the explicitly Christian Lord of Heaven and Earth, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But the human texture, the doubt, the resistance, the political calculus is lost in the piety of the sources. So let us imagine it from where the minter stood. He received the order, not from the king directly. The minter was important, but he was a craftsman, not a courtier.
The order came through the official channel, the royal treasurer, a man whose title in Ge'ez translated roughly as the one who weighs. The order was simple, and it was unprecedented. Remove the disk and crescent. Replace it with a cross. The disk and crescent, the symbols of the old Aksumite gods, probably associated with the celestial deities Astar, Beher, and Mether, a divine triad whose names appear in earlier royal inscriptions, had appeared on Aksumite coins for generations. They were the standard reverse symbol, as familiar and unremarkable as the eagle on an American quarter. And now they were to be erased, replaced by a symbol the minter had seen on the pendants of foreign merchants, on the small bronze lamps that the Christian community in Adulis used in their meetings, on the crude graffiti scratched into the walls of the port warehouses where sailors from Egypt and Syria gathered to pray. The cross. Did the minter hesitate? We cannot know, but we can consider what the request meant. A coin die is carved in negative. Every line, every curve must be incised in mirror image so that the struck coin reads correctly. The minter had spent decades perfecting the disk and crescent, the precise diameter of the disk, the rake of the crescent's horns, the way they balanced on the coin's field. Now he had to learn a new symbol, and not just learn it, master it. Because a royal coin was not a practice exercise. Every coin that left the workshop with a malformed cross, an unsteady line, a wobbled arm,
would be a statement about the king's new faith. A weak cross meant a weak commitment. The minter carved the new die. He started with the simplest form, a Greek cross, 4 equal arms, each terminating in a slight flare. He positioned it in the center of the reverse field, replacing the disk and crescent as precisely as one word replaces another in a revised inscription. He struck a test piece. He examined it in the light that fell through the workshop's narrow window, that high, clear Ethiopian light that makes everything sharp-edged and consequential. The cross stood clean. And with that single-struck test piece, Aksum became one of the first states in the world to put the Christian cross on its official currency. Before Constantine's Rome, before Byzantine Constantinople, before any European kingdom that would not exist for centuries, Aksum, an African kingdom on a highland plateau, minting gold coins with a Christian cross in the first half of the 4th century. Let that settle for a moment, because the implications are vast. Part 6. What Rome Knew. The Romans knew about Aksum. They knew quite a lot, actually.
The 3rd century Persian prophet Mani, founder of Manichaeism, a man who made it his business to catalogue the world's great powers, listed 4: Rome, Persia, China, and Aksum. 4 empires, and Aksum was one of them. This was not flattery. This was geopolitical analysis from a man who had traveled widely and understood the architecture of global power. The Roman Emperor Constantius II, son of Constantine, Arian Christian, perpetually embroiled in theological disputes, sent an embassy to Aksum in the 350s, attempting to persuade King Ezana to replace his Nicene bishop Frumentius with an Arian one. The theological details need not detain us, but the diplomatic fact is revealing. Rome treated Aksum as an equal, a sovereign power whose religious alignment mattered to the Roman strategic calculus. Ezana refused, incidentally. He kept Frumentius, he kept the Nicene faith, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has remained Monophysite, or rather Miaphysite, a distinction that matters enormously to theologians and almost not at all to anyone else, to this day, maintaining an unbroken liturgical tradition in Ge'ez that stretches back 17 centuries. 17 centuries. The same language, the same chants, the same fasting calendar, the same devotion to the Ark of the Covenant, which the Ethiopian Church claims to possess and keeps in a small chapel in Aksum, guarded by a single monk who never leaves the compound and who is the only person on earth permitted to see it. Is it really the Ark? Almost certainly not, in the strict archaeological sense, but that is not the point. The point is that a tradition preserved for 17 centuries has its own kind of truth, a truth that transcends the question of what is inside the box and asks instead, what does it mean that an entire civilization organized its spiritual life around the belief that it was chosen, that it held the most sacred object in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that its kings descended from Solomon and Sheba, that its highlands were a second Jerusalem? That belief shaped everything. It shaped the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved downward into solid stone in the 12th century, each one a monolithic miracle of engineering and faith. It shaped the medieval Solomonic dynasty, which claimed unbroken descent from the union of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, a genealogy that was political theology, not biology, but was no less real for that. It shaped the modern Ethiopian national identity, which draws on Aksum the way Greece draws on Athens and Italy draws on Rome, as origin, as proof, as the deep root that makes the present tree legitimate. And it all traces back to Ezana's choice, to the cross on the coin, to the minter's hand. It was also a kingdom of soldiers. Ezana's inscriptions, carved in Ge'ez, Greek, and the South Arabian script called Sabian, a trilingual practice clearly modeled on the famous inscriptions of the Achaemenid Persians, describe military campaigns of stunning scope. He campaigned against the Beja, the nomadic peoples of the Red Sea Hills. He fought the Nuba and the Kasu in the Nile Valley, peoples associated with the declining Meroitic kingdom, the last remnant of ancient Nubia. He crossed into South Arabia, intervening in the complex tribal politics of Yemen, projecting Aksumite power across the sea. One inscription, discovered at the site of ancient Meroe in Sudan, records Ezana's devastation of the Kushite capital in terms that are chillingly specific. Towns burned, cattle seized, people deported, grain stores destroyed. The Aksumites did not merely trade, they conquered. And their coinage traveled with their armies. The minters' gold coins were not just instruments of commerce, they were instruments of empire. When Aksumite soldiers occupied a region, Aksumite coins followed, integrating the conquered territory into the economic system of the Highland Kingdom. This is how empires work. The sword opens the door, the coin keeps it open. The minter understood this, even if he never articulated it in those terms. He knew that every coin he struck was a small, portable piece of the king's authority. He knew that a merchant in Yemen or a chieftain in Sudan holding an Aksumite gold piece was holding a compressed symbol of the entire apparatus, the armies, the obelisks, the ships, the god that stood behind it. And he knew, because any intelligent craftsman knows, that the symbol was more powerful than the thing it represented. The armies could be defeated, the obelisks could fall, the ships could sink, but the coin, once it entered circulation, lived its own life. It passed from hand to hand, crossed borders, survived the collapse of the power that produced it. Roman coins from the 3rd century still circulated in the 6th. Aksumite coins have been found in archaeological contexts centuries after the kingdom's decline. The symbol outlasts the substance, always. Part 8. The Peak. The 5th century, Aksum at its zenith. The kingdom controlled a territory stretching from the Eritrean coast to the Ethiopian Highlands to parts of western Arabia. Its navy, and yes, Aksum had a navy, a Red Sea fleet capable of transporting armies across open water, projected power as far as the Yemeni coast, where Aksumite governors ruled in the king's name. The city of Aksum itself was a place of stone palaces, multi-story elite residences, churches built on the foundations of older temples, and a thriving artisan quarter where metal workers, weavers, potters, and yes, minters practiced their crafts under royal patronage.
The coins of this period are the finest Aksum ever produced. The gold is pure, the portraits are detailed, the crosses are elaborately inlaid, not merely stamped, but gilded within gilded, a technique where the cross was rendered in a higher carat gold than the surrounding field, so that it gleamed brighter, stood out, caught the eye even in dim light. The minter, our minter, now in his 50s, his hand scarred and steady, his eyesight beginning to falter in the way that afflicts all people who spend decades doing close work by firelight, was producing the best work of his life. He had trained apprentices. His nephew, because the craft still passed through families, was learning to carve dies with the same precision, the same instinctive understanding of how a 3-dimensional face translates into a 2-dimensional relief that must read correctly when struck into soft metal at speed. The workshop had expanded. Where once there had been a single forge and a single anvil, there were now 3 forges, multiple crucibles, racks of dies organized by denomination, gold, silver, bronze, and a storage room where the finished coins were counted, weighed, and sealed in leather bags for distribution. Distribution to where? Everywhere. Aksumite coins of this period have been found in India, in the archaeological layers of port cities on the western Indian coast, mixed with Roman and Sassanid coins, evidence of a truly global circulation. They have been found in Egypt, in the Fayum oasis and the Nile Delta, where they circulated alongside Byzantine solidi. They have been found in South Arabia, in the stratigraphic layers corresponding to the period of Aksumite military intervention in Yemen. They have been found in Sri Lanka, in the ancient port of Mantai, where the currents of the Indian Ocean trade converged and coins from a dozen kingdoms mingled in the purses of cosmopolitan merchants. Sri Lanka. Think about that. A gold coin minted on the Ethiopian Highlands, carrying the face of an African king and a Christian cross, ending up in the hands of a Buddhist merchant on an island off the southern tip of India. The ancient world was not the isolated patchwork of separate civilizations that we sometimes imagine. It was a network, a web, a system of interconnected nodes linked by trade routes that spanned continents and oceans. And Aksum was a node, one of the most important nodes, and the minter's coins were the electric current that flowed through the wires. Part 9. The Intervention. In the early 6th century, around 520 CE, the Aksumite king Caleb launched one of the most remarkable military expeditions of late antiquity. He invaded Yemen. The cause was religious, or at least religion provided the justification.
A Jewish king named Du-Nuwas had seized power in the Himyarite kingdom of South Arabia and was persecuting the Christian community of Najran, a trading city in the southwestern Arabian Peninsula. The persecution was brutal. Sources describe massacres, forced conversions, the burning of churches with congregations locked inside. The Byzantine emperor Justin I, unable to project his own military power that far south, appealed to Caleb. The logic was clear. Aksum had the navy, Aksum had the proximity, Aksum had the Christian motivation. Caleb responded. He assembled a fleet. The sources disagree on the numbers. The most extravagant claims mention hundreds of ships, which is almost certainly exaggerated, but even a conservative estimate suggests a substantial amphibious operation, thousands of soldiers, horses, supplies, crossing the Red Sea and landing on the Arabian coast. The invasion succeeded. Du-Nuwas was defeated, killed, according to most sources, though the manner of his death varies between accounts. Some say he rode his horse into the sea. Some say he was killed in battle. The truth died with him. Caleb installed a Christian viceroy in Yemen. Aksumite soldiers garrisoned the major towns. Churches were built or rebuilt. The cross appeared on Himyarite soil. For a few decades, Aksum controlled both sides of the Red Sea, a territorial extent unmatched by any sub-Saharan African state until the modern era. But empires that stretch across water are always fragile. The distance between Aksum and Yemen was not vast, a few days' sailing in good weather, but it was enough. The viceroy, a man named Abraha, eventually declared himself independent. He ruled Yemen as his own kingdom, acknowledging Aksumite suzerainty in theory while ignoring it in practice. And then, in 570 CE, the very year, according to Islamic tradition, that Muhammad was born in Mecca, Abraha launched a famous military expedition against the Holy City, supposedly using war elephants brought from Africa. The expedition failed. The Quran memorializes it in Surah Al-Fil, the chapter of the elephant, describing how God sent flocks of birds carrying stones of baked clay to destroy Abraha's army. History, mythology, and theology collide in that single story, like three rivers meeting, and at the confluence stands Aksum, the African empire whose intervention in Arabia set in motion a chain of events that would, within a century, reshape the entire world.
because the Arabia that Muhammad was born into, the Arabia of competing tribes, of Christian and Jewish and pagan communities, of trade routes and pilgrimage sites and simmering political instability, was an Arabia that Aksum had helped to shape. The minter, had he lived that long, would not have known any of this. He would have been dead for decades, but his coins, his gold, his silver, his bronze, would still have been circulating.
Still carrying the cross, still speaking in the silent language of metal and symbol and struck authority, still saying, Aksum, remember Aksum. Empires do not fall, they deflate, slowly, imperceptibly, like a tire losing air on a long drive. The shape holds, the function continues, but the pressure drops, and by the time you notice the wobble, it's too late to stop. Aksum's decline was like this. No single catastrophe, no dramatic sacking by barbarian armies, no volcanic eruption or plague or flood that can be pointed to and named as the cause. Instead, a slow accumulation of pressures. The rise of Islam in the 7th century transformed the Red Sea from an Aksumite lake into a Muslim one. The ports that had funneled trade through Adulis were bypassed. New routes emerged, controlled by Arab merchants who had no need for Aksumite intermediaries. The ecological systems that supported the highland kingdom came under stress. Deforestation, the result of centuries of clearing land for agriculture and fuel, degraded the soil. Rainfall patterns may have shifted. The agricultural surplus that had fed the cities and funded the armies shrank. The South Arabian territories were lost, first to Abraha's rebellion, then to the Sassanid Persians, then definitively to the armies of the early caliphate. The coinage tells the story. The coins of the 6th century are smaller than those of the 4th. The gold content is lower. The die cutting is cruder, not because the minters had lost their skill, but because the system that supported their skill was contracting. Fewer coins were minted, fewer still were minted in gold. By the early 7th century, Aksumite coinage had ceased entirely. This is the clearest possible signal of economic collapse. A state that cannot mint its own coins is a state that has lost the trade networks, the gold supply, and the administrative capacity that coinage requires. The last known Aksumite coins date to approximately 630 CE. After that, silence. Not the silence of destruction. Aksum was never sacked, never burned, never violently erased. The silence of irrelevance. The city simply ceased to be a capital. The court moved south, deeper into the highlands, to locations that were more defensible and less dependent on the now defunct Red Sea trade. The great stelae still stood. The tombs still lay beneath them, sealed and undisturbed. The churches still held their services in gyes as they had since Izana's day. But the coins stopped, and with the coins stopped the minter's line. His nephew's grandson or great-grandson, or whoever the last master of the workshop was, struck the final coin, closed the forge, wrapped the dies in oiled cloth, and walked away. We do not know where he went. We do not know his name. We only know that he was the last.
Part 11. The Persistence. But here is what survived. The language survived. Ge'ez is still read, still chanted, still the liturgical tongue of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which claims over 40 million adherents and maintains a monastic tradition that has never been interrupted. Not by the rise of Islam, not by the medieval wars of the Zagwe and Solomonic dynasties, not by the Italian invasion, not by the Derg Revolution, not by anything.
The script survived. Ge'ez gave birth to Amharic, Tigrinya, and Tigray, living languages spoken by tens of millions of people, all written in the distinctive alpha syllabary that evolved from those ancient inscriptions. The obelisks survived. The stelae of Aksum still stand, most of them anyway. The great stelae fell, probably during or shortly after its erection, crashing to the ground and breaking into massive fragments that still lie where they landed. But the second largest stelae, 24 meters tall, 170 tons, stood for 16 centuries before the Italian fascists dismantled it and shipped it to Rome in 1937 as a trophy of conquest. It was returned to Ethiopia in 2005, reassembled and re-erected in its original location. 68 years in exile, and then it came home. Imagine the minter seeing that. Imagine showing him the photographs of the Italian soldiers dismantling the obelisk, crating it, loading it onto a ship. Imagine his confusion, his outrage. And then imagine showing him the photographs of the return, the crowds in Aksum cheering, the crane lifting each section back into place, the stelae rising again against the Ethiopian sky for the first time in 7 decades. He would have understood. Symbols endure. That was his whole life's lesson. That was the principle encoded in every coin he ever struck. The king dies. The gold remains. The empire falls. The cross remains. The workshop closes. The die remains. Part 12. What the Coins Say. Today, Aksumite coins are among the most studied artifacts of ancient African civilization. They are also among the most beautiful. The gold coins of the 4th and 5th centuries in particular display a level of artistry that rivals contemporary Roman and Byzantine work. The royal portraits are vivid, broad faces, large eyes, elaborate headdresses or crowns. The inscriptions are crisp. The crosses, especially the later inlaid crosses, where the symbol is rendered in a contrasting gold alloy that makes it glow against the field, are exquisite. Numismatists have identified over 100 distinct coin types, spanning roughly 3 centuries and more than 20 kings. The sequence of issues allows scholars to reconstruct the succession of Aksumite rulers. In many cases, the coins are the only evidence that a particular king existed at all. Think about that.
A man's entire historical existence, his name, his approximate dates, his religious affiliation, his claim to authority, survives only because a minter carved his face into a bronze die and struck it onto a disc of gold. The coin as biography, the coin as tombstone, the coin as proof of life. The minter would have appreciated the irony, or perhaps not irony. Perhaps he would have seen it as the natural order of things. The stone crumbles, the inscription fades, the manuscript is eaten by termites. But the coin, buried, lost, dropped into a well, sealed in a jar, forgotten in a pocket, swept into a gutter and covered by centuries of accumulated dirt, the coin survives, because gold does not corrode, because gold does not decay, because gold, once struck with a human image, holds that image forever. Forever. The same face the minter saw emerging from the die on a hot afternoon in the Aksumite workshop 17 centuries ago is the face you can see today in the glass case of a museum, lit by halogen lights, labeled with a small card that says something like, "Gold coin of Ezana, king of Aksum, CE 330 to 360. Obverse, royal bust. Reverse, cross." The card does not mention the minter. No card ever does. But his hands are there, in the weight of the coin, in the depth of the strike, in the precision of the cross's arms,
in the slight irregularity, invisible to the casual viewer, obvious to a trained numismatist, where the die shifted fractionally during the strike, leaving a ghost image, a faint doubling, a trace of the moment when metal met metal, and a human being, standing in a stone workshop on an African plateau, brought his hammer down. Part 13. The Last Things. Night falls over Aksum, not the ancient Aksum, the modern town, a small place now, 30,000 people, a regional center in the Tigray region of northern Ethiopia. The stelae still stand in their field, fenced off, protected, visited by tourists who come for the obelisks and stay for the churches. The Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion stands nearby, the holiest church in Ethiopian Orthodoxy, the place where the Ark is said to rest. A monk sits in the small chapel beside it, as a monk has sat there for centuries, guarding something that no one else is allowed to see. What is he guarding? Does it matter? What matters is that he sits there, that the tradition continues, that 17 centuries of unbroken faith link the modern monk to Frumentius, link Frumentius to Izana, link Izana to the moment the cross first appeared on the coins. The thread is unbroken, and the coins are the evidence.
Scattered now across the world, in the British Museum, in the Bibliothèque Nationale, in the Ashmolean, in the National Museum of Ethiopia in Addis Ababa, in private collections, in archaeological storerooms, in the earth itself, still waiting to be found, the minter's coins are the physical proof that a great civilization existed, thrived, believed, traded, fought, built, and endured. They are small, smaller than a thumbnail, lighter than a breath, but they carry the weight of an empire. And if you hold one, if you are ever lucky enough to hold a genuine Aksumite gold coin in the palm of your hand, you will feel it. Not the weight of the gold, though that is real enough, but the weight of the human intention behind it. The minter chose this alloy. He carved this die. He positioned this blank. He raised this hammer. He brought it down once, precisely, irrevocably, and in the ringing impact of bronze on gold, he created something that would outlast his king, his kingdom, his language as a spoken tongue, his city as a capital, his religion as a minority faith in a region overwhelmed by other religions, his entire world as a functional political entity. He created something permanent. And permanence in a world where everything decays, everything changes, everything passes, permanence is the closest thing to immortality that human hands can achieve. The forge is cold now. The workshop is rubble. The dies are lost, dissolved by rust, shattered by earth pressure, scattered by the slow tectonic churning of soil over centuries. But the coins remain. Clean them carefully, a soft brush, distilled water, patience, and the face appears. The cross appears. The Ge'ez inscription appears, letter by precise letter, announcing the name and title of a king who ruled an empire that most people alive today have never heard of. The minter's hands are gone, but his strikes endure. His gold still gleams, his cross still stands, as it stood on the first test piece in the sharp Ethiopian light on the morning that Aksum declared itself to the world. Still stands, after the empire, after the silence, after the forgetting, still, small enough to hold in a palm, bright enough to outlast the sun, an Aksumite coin, a cross in gold, a man's whole life compressed into the space between the hammer and the die, still ringing after all this time, still ringing.